Hi guys. So jazz musicians often talk about using two different approaches to improvisation. The horizontal approach, where you think in terms of scales, for example, using the C Lydian mode over a C major 7 chord. Or a vertical approach where you think in terms of chords or arpeggios over the chord. So again, for example, over that same C major 7 chord in the left hand, we could think about our improvisation as primarily a C major 7 chord surrounded or connected by quick little passing notes that you move through very quickly, don't really sit on or emphasize, and you only really sit and emphasize on those C major 7 arpeggio notes, the chord tones. Now this vertical approach can of course be expanded to include not just the 7th chord, but also the available tensions of that chord. So instead of playing 1 3 5 7, you might play 3 5 7 9 or 5 7 9 sharp 11 or 7 9 sharp 11 13. So in this way, you're still thinking and playing vertically. That is, you're still thinking about it in terms of the chord that you're playing, the C major 7, but you've got a lot more notes at your disposal. So you can emphasize and hold the sharp 11, say, or the 9th as part of your arpeggio or phrase, rather than just treating them as passing notes and moving through them quickly, on your way to a 3rd or a 5th or a root or something. Now these kind of extended arpeggios where you're not just playing the 7th chord, you're playing up to the 9th or the 11th or some kind of available tension, are very, very common, widely used, especially in bebop where they would often arpeggiate up to a flat 9 over a dominant chord, for example, but definitely expands the colors and sounds that you can use while still staying true to that vertical paradigm or mindset or approach. And this brings us to the idea of a triad pair. Now, a triad pair are two triads that are next to each other, usually a whole step apart, but they could in theory be a half step as well, that do not share any notes in common. So for example, a C major triad and a D major triad could be a triad pair. And we could use those two triads, arpeggiate those two triads, to improvise over a C major 7 chord. Right, they're next to each other and they don't share any notes in common. Now, the idea is that we use these two triads to improvise over a particular chord by sequentially arpeggiating them. So you would improvise using the notes of the C triad and then the D triad, then if you've got time go back to the C triad and the D triad again, and so on. Now you could play them as a sequence, so essentially establish a pattern and then repeat that pattern up with the next triad, and then maybe even up in the next inversion of the original triad. So for example, something simple like just going up each chord as a straight ascending arpeggio. Right, so there I'm playing the exact same pattern, or I'm playing the same thing with each chord, and it's a real simple, just ascending arpeggio. You play the C triad, then the D triad ascending, then the C again in the next inversion, D in the next inversion, C in the next inversion, D in the next inversion, and so on. But you don't have to set up a sequence or this kind of pattern. You could just improvise freely, doing whatever you like, but only sticking to the notes of each chord and switching back between the two triads. So still switching back between those two triads, the C and the D, but playing different and unique and free patterns with each. So play something on the C, into the D, back to the C, back to the D, back to the C. Now triads are really harmonically strong, right? They're the most basic chord, and we're all incredibly comfortable with triads because they've been around for hundreds of years, and they generally form the basis of the harmony in almost all music. So using triads as the basis of your improvisation will give you a very structured and harmonically strong solo. But using a single arpeggio, say a C major triad over a C major or C major 7 chord, is going to very, very quickly sound incredibly boring because you've only got 3 notes to play with. So alternating between 2 different triads creates a lot more movement and interest in your solo. And so you can kind of disguise the fact that you're just arpeggiating triads. It sounds like there's a lot more happening, that it's a lot more complex, but it's not. You're just arpeggiating triads up and down. So you still have that kind of harmonic strength and structure of the triads in your solo, but balanced against that is the interest created by alternating between 2 different triads. And if you've been paying attention, you would have noticed that a triad pair is really just a specific way of playing an extended arpeggio. So over a C major 7 chord, the C triad is the 1, 3, 5 of the chord, and the D triad is the 9, sharp 11, and 13 of the chord. And this is typically how you'll see triad pairs used in practice. They'll generally be made out of chord tones or available tensions of the chord. So you're effectively improvising vertically, but you're splitting up the big extended 13th chord into 2 smaller chords, in this case triads. And this is the way you would generally build triad pairs. You'd take a chord and then you would find 2 triads next to each other that don't repeat any of the same notes and only use chord tones or available tensions of the chord. So over a C major 7, for example, you could use C and D triads. Or E minor and F sharp diminished. Or G major and A minor. Over a C minor 7 chord, you could use C minor and D minor. Or E flat and F, and that'll give you a bit of a Dorian sound with the A natural in there. Or F minor and G minor, and with that A flat, that'll give you a bit more of an Aeolian or natural minor sound. But this technique gets a lot more interesting with dominant chords precisely because it has so many more available tensions. Almost all the notes, bar 2 in an octave, are available tensions over a dominant chord. So over a C7 chord, you could use G flat and A flat triads. Or D and E flat. Or G minor and A major triads. Right, but there's a heap more, especially over dominant chords, that you can use precisely because it's got so many available tensions, so many available notes that you can play over the top of a dominant chord. Right, and each triad pair will still sound quite strong because you're essentially just combining arpeggios of 2 neighboring triads, but each one will give a slightly different flavor or taste because you're playing different notes, different tensions, different chord tones in relation to your chord, your bass chord. Now this is actually very similar to the concept of upper structures, which is a particular way of voicing chords where you have a triad in your right hand. But upper structures are a harmonic concept, whereas this is a melodic concept. Now, if you don't know what upper structures are, that doesn't matter. You don't really need to know. I just thought I'd mention it. I do have a separate video on upper structures if you are interested though. So essentially the way you would use this in an improvisation in practice is that you would take the chord progression, you would sit down, you would go chord by chord and figure out what triad pairs fit over each chord and then apply them or use them over that chord, over each chord through the progression. So for example, just taking a simple 2-5-1 in C major, over the D minor chord we could play D minor and E minor triad. Over the G7 chord we could play the E flat and D flat triads, and over the C major 7 chord we could play the D and E minor triads. Now running through that progression you could get something like right, so this technique gives a really interesting, quite modern, a little bit sort of disjointed, surreal sound, but it's still quite nice, it's still quite interesting to listen to, and it gives you a simple framework within which to work. And if you want a good example of this being used in practice, have a listen to Oliver Nelson's solo in Stolen Moments, where he takes the C minor and D minor triads over a C minor chord and just repeats them over and over again. Then he does the same with F minor and G minor when the chord moves to the F minor. And then he moves up and stuff. The beginning of his solo is quite triadic, right? Really relying on the sound of those triads and moving those triads around up and down by step, then with the chord, and then, you know, up by step. Sounds great. It's a very iconic solo. So have a listen to it. Cool, that's it for me. Thanks for watching, guys, and I will see you next time.